to see such a full room here. Eve has, of course, as she always does, charmed everybody who's had the good fortune to have met her among them. Eve Watson-Liz, we probably all know, involved in psychoanalytic practice, training, education, and research in Dublin, Ireland, where she lives with her wife, Deirdre. She has published dozens of essays on psychoanalysis, sexuality, on film, on culture, and on literature. Her co-edited books are very many. They include Freud's Principal Case Studies Revisited, Freudian-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Reconsider the Legacy, 2025 on Routledge. Critical Essays on the Drive, Lacanian Theory and Practice, 2024. Clinical Encounters in Sexuality, Psychoanalytic Practice and Queer Theory, 2017. And in 2026, a forthcoming collection on James Joyce's writing and her own author book on psychoanalysis and film. And indeed, she is also at the moment co-editing a series of essays on the same James Joyce, I'm delighted to say, for our own Era Ireland, a special edition, and that's arising from the Joyce in Paris conference that we had so much fun at not so awfully long ago. Eve is the academic director of the Freud Lacan Institute and was the editor of Lacunae, the international journal for Lacanian Psychoanalysis. She is a member of the Editorial Boards of Lacunae, the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, and the European Journal of Qualitative Research in Psychotherapy. My goodness, this goes on. Wonderful. In 2022, she was the Erik Erikson Scholar-in-Residence at the Austen Riggs Centre in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and now, today, she is, I'm delighted to say, of course, our Burns Scholar here. But a little more, Eve is my very good friend, a companion beyond compare. Many of the happiest times I've spent in these last few years have been in the company of Eve and her wonderful wife. For those reasons, I can hardly say how happy and delighted I am to introduce her to you here today.
Thank you, Joe. I was not expecting that. Thank you. Absolutely delighted. Thank you. How wonderful to see such a full room. This is wonderful. And I was not expecting that either. So I've been surprised on many counts already this evening. I'm really looking forward to this talk. I've been working on it for a while. I expect it will take about 55 minutes or so, and I have 3 film clips to show along the way. So, hoping all will go well. One seems to be queued up, so I think we're in good shape, at least for the first one. So, hopefully that, because I think the clips are actually will go very nicely with various points we can really see. So that's effectively it. So I'm going to get going, and please tell me if I'm going.
Could you talk into the mic?
Talking to the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening. I am very honored to be giving the Burns lecture as the Burns visiting scholar, and it is great to see you all. Dear colleagues, friends, old and new, and those of you here out of interest in tonight's themes. But first things first. This is a unique opportunity for me to extend my grateful appreciation to a number of people. I'll start with Christian DuPont, who is responsible for this evening's event, and in spite of carrying the awesome mantle of responsibility for Boston College's libraries and archives, has unfailingly answered my many questions and kept watch on my stay here with unparalleled hospitality and warmth. To all of my colleagues in Irish Studies, who have made me feel so at home, and whose collegiality and congeniality I will never forget. The Chair of Irish Studies, Guy Biner, and Joe Nugent, Rachel, Maria, Jim, Marjorie, Richard, Dermot, Rob, Marcus, Sheila, Vera, Colleen, Caroline, and Andrew. I'm so grateful to you. What I have given to have been a fly on the wall at the meeting when you picked a psychoanalyst as one of the next Burns visiting scholars. I appreciate the openness of the Irish Studies faculty to psychoanalysis. which at its heart is it interdisciplinary, as am I. And working with the so-called unanalyzable Irish, a remark Freud was supposed to have said, but for which there is absolutely no record whatsoever of him saying. This fiction has reached far into the social consciousness, so much so that the well-known Irish actor Gabriel Byrne is to be found referring to it in an interview he gave on Sherwood a number of years ago, where he plays, you guessed it, a psychoanalyst. So he refers to the unanalyzability of the Irish. Tell this unanalyzability nonsense to the Irish Studies faculty here, who are leading the way in analyses of many facets of Irish life, culture, history, politics, and the arts and humanities. There's perhaps never been a more urgent time than now for the voicing, remembering, and recollecting of our history, which is by definition not only about accomplishments, but is destined to include trauma at a time when the world is pivoting towards technological dehumanization and the vision of history for the fleeting pleasures of the here and now and the promises of the future. History is not another country. It is surely a stain, a scotoma in the present that looks at us and dares us to come up with a reply. Sometimes that reply is research and knowledge. Sometimes it's a construction and a push to create something new. Sometimes it's a pressure point of resistance that affects a suturing of present-day fictions. There is, for example, much analysis of the history of fascism and autocracy at the moment as the fiction of the coherence and permanence of democracy is public. But before going further, a few more thanks are to be made. Thank you to members of faculty and staff who've made time to come along this evening and join in the fray. And to my erstwhile and committed students who I see here, and who I hope are here for more than just the extra credit and the refreshments. I extend my thanks to the artist Adam Young, a Newfoundland-based artist who gave permission to use the stunning image you see on the posters. And to my dear resident friends here in Boston, and a special mention to Catherine and Gary, who 30 years after my undergraduate days in the area are still making sure the fridge is stocked and dinner invites are issued with regularity. To you, I extend my most heartfelt thanks. And to those here this evening, as this seemed the best on offer, let's see where we can get with an exploration of Irish culture and psyche through recent literary and cinematic depictions. Thoroughly modern Ireland has arrived like a freight train into the 21st century. We are, long before this came to be hip to say these days, at 6s and 7s in trying to keep up with so much change that has taken place over the last several decades. As Paige Reynolds notes in her introduction to the New Irish Studies, the rate of change over the last 2 decades in Ireland, quote, reflects the common understanding of the contemporary as a moment of acceleration and flux. End quote. Secularization, divorce, peace in Northern Ireland, economic boom and bust, marriage equality, abortion, greater ethnic and racial diversity, and a bigger relationship with the European Union position Ireland as a leading liberal social democracy today. With these changes and the loosening of rigid binaries, it is suggested by Reynolds that for some, this encompasses a liminal experience of living between identities and cultures. To be Irish is a much wider, more international question. We have our problems, of course, with homelessness, gender inequality, with ultra-right forms of nationalism and violence against women on the rise, and fringe extremes threatening to become less marginalized. But so far, the country is more or less holding its middle own, with centrist policies dominating and an Irish-speaking woman president just elected. She was inaugurated yesterday. Nonetheless, we do well to acknowledge that we are somewhat breathlessly catching up. How could we not be? How, for example, do we reconcile the fact that women were incarcerated in mother and baby homes for having babies outside of marriage until as recently as 1996, with the closure of the last Magdalen laundry on Sean McDermott Street in Dublin in 1996, with the fact that as per the last census in 2023, 39% of babies born in Ireland are born outside of marriage, with no one batting so much as an eyelid. How do we reconcile the criminalization of homosexuality until 1993 with the fact that we had a gay prime minister from 2017 to 2022? It's not that romantic Ireland is dead and gone, as Yeats had it. It's that repressive, conservative, mouldering, lace-curtained Ireland is dead and gone. And good riddance, we may say, to a very bad lot, especially as it was for the underprivileged, for women, for the scapegoat. Not easily is the answer to the question of reconciling present and past. And a proof of this lies in the plethora of literature and cinema recently produced that plies its trade in the second half of the 20th century, the time preceding these recent momentous developments that have so utterly transformed the country. My suggestion to you today is that there is an important labor of recollection and remembering in these works that refuse to let the past slip away and be forgotten, or more alarmingly, to be repressed. There is certainly a nostalgia playing in these works, certainly. That seems to be a trait the Irish are forever saddled with. But is there not also a call, perhaps a plea, to moments of yesterday that suggest we are attempting through them to make sense of today, so that tomorrow might not be so daunting? The enormous rate of change being something human beings are particularly ill-equipped to deal with, change itself being something human beings are particularly ill-equipped to deal with, has spurred a turn to wondering, to assessing what has been lost as well as what has been gained. The exquisitely slow, ponderous, and at times melancholic pace of the 2023 film That They May Face the Rising Sun, set in the 1980s, is indicative of a renewed interest in a time when people actually had conversations, and dating was something other than hooking up on Tinder or Bumble. And when, as Anne Enright and Claire Keegan document so vividly in their writings, people fell in love with the wrong people and did the wrong things and made bad choices, and they didn't end up as cancelled, and they were not expected to magically make over their lives and fix them. I never fail to be taken aback at the relief people express when they are refused a fix, especially a quick one, in their psychoanalysis, and then come to realize to their immense relief that the wanting of a fix, to be fixed, would spoil their chances at figuring out what they actually want and don't want. We're on our way when this is unquestionably but kindly refused. To illustrate some of these points, let's have a little look at a clip from That They May Face the Rising Sun. So in the clip I'm going to show you the protagonist Joe, based on McGavin himself, who wrote the book on which the film is based, is a writer and is relocated to rural County Leitrim with his artist wife. She's European. They've returned against the tide, as is noted, the tide being, of course, the immigration tide. In the scene, which captures life as slow and ponderous, Joe and his wife are spending time with a local man about town and garage owner known as the Shah. And then they walk out to the fields and off. So I'm going to just play this out. I like to think of the recent writing by Claire Keegan and Anne Enright and the films such as That They May Face the Rising Sun, Song of the Sea, The Banshees of Inisherin, and The Quiet Girl. Those are 4 films I've chosen to focus on. as not simply an exercise in nostalgia, but as engaging in a rememorization of a time that we might think of as antecedent and bygone, but which is not yet historicized and localized, but remains free-floating, unfinished, unassimilated, and is therefore present, or is at least close to the surface, and therefore at times troubles and anguishes. We make stories, of course, to fill in the blanks of the past. Sometimes these stories are true and even factual. It's, however, the making and the remaking of stories, of story in the past, that offers a way out of an endless circuit of repetition in which the past returns, not only and with more bite. Freud, the repressed returns along with that which aided the repression. Repression 2.0. There is a brilliant and excruciating example of this in Claire Keegan's 2023 novella, So Late in the Day. In this short abstract that I'm going to read to you, the story's protagonist, Cotton, a man advancing professionally as a mid-level civil servant, is remembering a scene at home with his mother, father, and brother. I'm just going to read you the abstract. For those of you that read the book, I have no doubt this will, you will recall this. At one point, something from years ago came back to him. His mother standing at the gas cooker, making buttermilk pancakes, turning them on the pan. His father was at the head of the table, with himself and his brother seated on either side. Both were in their 20s at that time, in college, and had gone home for the weekend and their laundry. His mother had served everyone, brought their plates to the table, and they had begun to eat. When she went to sit down with her own plate, his brother had reached out and quickly pulled the chair from under her, and she had fallen backwards onto the floor. She must have been near 60 years of age at the time, as she had married late, but his father had laughed. All three of them had laughed, heartily, and had kept on laughing while she picked up pancakes and the pieces of the broken plate off the floor. If a part of Cahill now wondered how he might have turned out if his father had been another type of man and had not laughed, Cahill did not let his mind dwell on it. He told himself it meant little, and it was just a bad joke. I actually find in reading this that Keegan's punctuation, the emphasis that she gives on their laughing, comma, heartily, comma, slams the reader twice. There is, of course, a meanness of spirit, a sadistic and cruel quality that disturbs. Alongside the pathos she evokes of this man's refusal to go there and examine what he knows to be his unfortunate paternal inheritance. Pathos because his meanness is what in the end ruptures the relationship with the woman he wants to marry. Keegan's commentary here is not just about masculinity, but about a kind of relationality that is troubled by a denial of influence, by the sad and solitary making effects of a repression left untreated, of trauma left as a seeping wound. We could anticipate Cahill's next thought to be the dreaded and resigned, it is what it is. The nucleus of repression is trauma, and this is talked about psychoanalysis for a moment now. The nucleus of repression is trauma. And until we give voice to what is refused by the ego and repressed, we will be painfully and symptomatically troubled by it. It will speak obliquely in pathologies, anxieties, and in crises of inhibition and despair. That's the process of repression and its connection to trauma, but we may well ask, what do we understand by trauma? It is our inability to process something that is powerful enough to overwhelm our defenses and our resources. The essence of it is the experience of helplessness, and it is a universal, of the human condition. We are all subject to it, from birth to the acquisition of language, although some experience it more deeply and more consequentially due to various factors and experiences. Might perhaps the rising levels of depression and anxiety in Ireland, especially in young people, have even a little something to do with our forgotten history, with the displacement of our relationship to the land, with the necessity of voicing and revoicing what has come before, not as a historical remnant of a bygone era, but that modern 21st century Ireland, as any nation and culture, stands not just on the glories of independence and revolution, and more recently the freedoms of liberal democracy, but also on the shoulders of traumatic experiences, some large, some small, which include profound helplessness, desperate acts, guilty and sometimes cruel desires, terrible choices, and sacrifice. The recently departed and much lamented Lacanian McGann, a principal storyteller and extoller of the Irish language, and author of the brilliant 32 Words for Field, and more recently 99 Words for Rain, takes this up in his way, connecting language to the land, and this is a quote from Lacan. The bogs, the rivers, mountains, and shorelines are more than preservers of old myths, bones, and memories. They are energy banks and time sponges, and what is held within them seeks release. Speaking of release, we must be careful that we are not substituting one form of repression for another. Can we not, for example, think of the rising levels of HIV in Ireland in 2024, and especially among gay men, as having something to do with the paucity today of the history of the devastating HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s? Perhaps more controversially, the effort in recent years to enact reproductive legislation that would obviate, that would remove the requirement for a register of donor names. I'm not at all suggesting that a donor is equivalent to a parent, but that we benefit from discussing and debating the fact that we are continuing to bear witness to a deeply traumatic history of 70 plus years since the founding of the Irish Free State in 1922, of improper records of so-called illegitimate children. We don't have to be postmodern about everything and dispense with all things deemed to be yesterday. The problem is we could be left with a landscape of denial, of refusing certain truths and potentialities, that in the words of the great Irish historian Roy Foster, who quotes one of the Romantic commentators, this could leave us, quote, this is Roy Foster, placed between memory and hope, the race that will never conquer what it desires, and it will never discover what it regrets. End quote. This talk, I keep promising, is about memory and remembering. I'm pausing to think of Anne Enright, who in The Gathering, that was her 2007 Vancouver Prize-winning novel, describes history as romantic, and then goes on to make it completely lost, the slow uprooting of a past that is remembered, misremembered, partially remembered, constructed, troublesome, at times despairing and ravaging, and yet she makes it necessary. Putting meat on the bare bones, she describes on page 1 of The Gathering, can be a dirty business. Enright, a self-declared reader of psychoanalysis, insists on memory as a process of construction, a scaffolding that requires storying, blending real and reality, and her writing shows that its rendering into thought and speech carries within it promises of truths that range from the scurrilous to the sacrosanct, from beautiful to banal, from abstract to cogent, and in the end, from imprisonment to freedom. That freedom can be leading a marriage, or an affair, or the letting go of identities and connections that have ceased to offer coherence or meaning. It seems that throughout so much of her writing, she iterates, as any psychoanalyst worth their salt would, that there's no way around the truth, only through it. And the slow, painful unwrapping of a history is a journey that is in the end worth doing. This often requires additions, subtractions, liberal flourishes. For example, is this memory real? Perhaps not, but it matters anyway, and is a stepping stone to the next one, as she insists in the gathering. And while the transformation of a history into a life story is valuable and enriching in the effective release of its telling, it is invaluable for the freeing effects and potentialities that come with it. There's no undoing neurosis or even madness, as the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan argued, but we can have better and less troubling symptoms. One of the greatest producers of symptoms is unarticulated history, and what psychoanalysts refer to as the reneging of desire, or giving round to our desire. This reneging of desire festers in knottings of discontent, impotence, despair, or guilt, and if you will allow me, not as a consequence of chemical imbalances. Veronica, the gathering's protagonist, is underwater, guiltily suffocating in unfulfilled desire and hidden trauma, which she transposes onto her grandmother and all around her, her dead brother, her siblings, her parents, her husband, as she constructs an architecture of hidden and lost desire. Imagining them, the hidden and lost desires, imagining them, constructing them as she tries to find a way to her goal. Maybe it's in the nice Jewish boy, Michael Weiss, from her college days. His languid ease reminds her of what was and what could be. Alcoholism suffuses and is an agonist of her guilty suffering, and more broadly within the Hegarty family. Might we say that his thirst for drink is emblematic of a nation still rife with forgotten trauma and repressed history? A ridiculous generalization, of course, but pointing to an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Disinhibitory libations offered to the unexpressed and inexpressible histories. For as Freud pointed out, the creation of memory is not actually a process of remembering, but rather a process of reminiscence, which is actually storytelling. If we are anything, as the Argentinian psychoanalyst Nestor Bronstein notes, we are the consequence of certain uncertain reminiscences. We are not who we are because of what happened to us, but because of how we have registered them and understood what happened in a certain way. To reminisce usually involves an enjoyment in recollecting, and it is sometimes pleasurable, but not always. There is, of course, another kind of remembering, the traumatic recollecting that is repetition compulsion, painful memories coming unbidden, such as we see in post-traumatic stress disorder, which should be rightfully called post-traumatic compulsive remembering disorder. I'm sure the DSM here would like that. But it is post-traumatic compulsive remembering disorder. It's understated to call it a stress disorder, sure. The of remembering can be very difficult. But by giving voice to something hidden, forgotten, or as yet unsaid, we give it a place in the symbolic, where it can be autonomized, set adrift within language, where it can be divested of its ferocious power to intimidate, terrorize, and limit, and where other possibilities may come to be. As Enright emphasizes over and over again in her writing, the search for the origin or cause is shown to be of uncertain historical accuracy. In an early novel, The Forgotten Waltz, She captures memory as a kind of waltz through mirrors of the present, when she writes, quote, "Still I can't be too bothered here with chronology." The idea, if you can tell it one thing after another, then everything will make sense. It doesn't make sense. End quote. For Veronica in The Gathering, her search for the cause of her beloved brother's suicide propels her on a family journey where certain events may or may not have taken place, that she may or may not have witnessed, including sins of the flesh, the illicit, the repressed sexual that Freud was vilified for suggesting was in every symptom. It is this journeying for Veronica that in its very meandering brings forth her choice of neurosis, and her brother's too, though it's hardly a choice when we're children, except that we can choose to be mute, or sad, or silent, or serious, or absent within a circuit of repetition, patterning that is replete with inheritance and the experiential. We cannot know who we are without integrating past experience. That's the meat, fat, and skin over N. Wright's bare bones that she begins The Gathering with. In broader terms, isn't that what the country is endeavoring to make room for? A history of a free state that also perpetuated abuses and obscenities with impunity against its most vulnerable and unsupported citizens. But N. Wright's concern is more localized. It's the traumatic histories within families that she picks clean for their significance in shaping and forming and indeed remaking. The zinger is the novel's ending, with the boy Rowan, a second coming, a new arrival, her brother's son, and we're led to think that Veronica has relinquished the haunting spectre of her dead brother. It's the belief in the next generation. It will not only do better than us, but help us heal. There are days, muses, Amy Adams' linguist character in the 2016 film Arrival, when she's a film about memory and deciphering the discourse of the other. She says, there are days that define your story beyond your life. Zadie Smith recently said that to be a writer is to be resistant, that writing is always a resistance. The history of the arcane Irish censorship laws speaks to that. The Irish are certainly good at storytelling, at using story, narrative, myth, and even fairy tale to frame life and experience, past and present. It's built into the cultural fabric and continues in literature and cinema, which inherit the great oral traditions of the past. It's great to see today research projects that incorporate both oral and written elements of our history, such as that of Pádraig Kerrigan, who recently visited Boston College Irish Studies from University College Dublin. In his Flatley lecture, he spoke of the oral history he is collecting of Dublin's Hirschfeld Centre, Ireland's first gay and lesbian centre established in 1979. There are no written records remaining. It burnt to the ground in 1989, probably by arson, but the oral histories he is collecting will be assembled, incorporated, and hopefully given a place in the symbolic. There is a creation. This is a creation. Something in place of nothing. But as Freud pointed out in his posthumously published project, we don't actually begin with nothing. We begin with trauma, then nothing, then something. In the gap, something, a signifier, a languaging, a containing. It's strange to think of something generative coming from trauma, but that's why we build memorials, teach history, create art, and who knows, maybe even reduce the transmission of a viral load heavy with unspoken history. It's a weakness, but I've always been impressed at how cinema is so often a mirror of cultural stress points, anomalies, and lacunae. In cinema recently, we seem to be preoccupied with the next generation. a sure sign of the present generation's world. I'm thinking of two films in particular, Song of the Sea and The Quiet Girl. Song of the Sea is the creation of Tom Moore and Company of Cartoon Saloon in Kilkenny. Among other things, this beautiful, animated, Oscar-nominated children's film is about the importance of mourning, letting go, allowing children to have agency, and it highlights the danger of refusing to engage with traumatic loss. Yes, all that in a children's film. It packs a lot in. The story centers on Saoirse, a 6-year-old girl who has been mute since the death of her mother at her birth. Her mother, who's been named Rona, a name that carries within it the word groan, the Irish word for sadness. Saoirse carries her groan within her, and this is symbolized by a deep connection to the sea, as she, like her mother, is a selkie, a seal-like creature that symbolizes a mysterious otherness, an otherness that is often assigned to the feminine realm. The myth of feminine mystery, or mystique, as it's sometimes called, is mythical because it doesn't exist. I mean, what woman has ever actually said, never mind peace, that she's composed of or the keeper of mystery? But this is an ascription that is and perhaps ever will be attributed to women. And we can understand this to be what psychoanalysis frames as the sexual non-rapport, that there is no seamless unity between the sexes, and an insurmountable difference remains. The otherness, in which one is not reducible to the other, is this quality of mystique, or fascinating attraction, from the Latin mysticus, with its etymology rooted in the rites and secrets of mystics. Didn't Mae West capture this perfectly when she said that men went to sleep with Mae West, but they woke up with her? Back to Song of the Sea. The 6-year-old girl, Saoirse, is mute, and we surmise that this carries within it the collective burden of the unspoken, ungrieved loss of the family, loss of the family. Her father, who is frozen with it, her grandmother, who wants desperately to fix it, and her brother, who loves her, but blames her and resentfully looks after her, having been charged to do so. The film weaves a typical tale of childhood heroism, children omnipotently overcoming the world of unhelpful adults, and it draws heavily from the Irish myths of Monaghan Lochlear, Colin, Medina She, the fairies, otherwise known as the other folk, as well as the Celtic imagery, and the most ethereal singing and music you could imagine. The enchantment and wonder of this film is its fairy tale quality. That of the selkie and the fairies, the sweep of a child's imagination, which aims arrow-like at something beyond understanding, to the reaches of the unconscious. It's a 2D animation, we will see as we will see in a moment. And this 2D animation, I suggest, helps with augmenting the idea that we are within the child's reality. And it makes the film like a work of art in its depth and richness. Fairy tales, Bruno Bettelheim argues in Uses of Enchantment, convey to children that a struggle against severe difficulties in life is an intrinsic aspect of human existence, and one is better off in meeting this. We can see this in the first lines of the film, which are recited, so the film begins with these lines being recited. Again, I remind you, this is an animated children's, so it's a very popular animated children's. These are the lines. And they are from Yeats's poem, Stolen Child. Come away, O human child, into the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Fairy tales tend to convey what children's stories don't. Predicaments and existential dilemmas such as aging, death, loss, the dark side of human nature, the absence of virtue, the omnipresence of good and evil, and the propensities for both in everyone. They guide the child to give up its early attachments and infantile dependencies and point to a more independent existence. Sadly, few fairy tales are told today, except we have the gorgeous Song of the Sea. A fairy tale in its own right, and it makes an impression in its embrace of the old pagan ways, the sea, the land, Ireland's pastoral beauty, trees, animals, the rain, as well as the arc of its narrative. When Saoirse is finally reunited with the spirit of her mother, this is near the end of the film, when a literal mutism of repression is lifted, she sings, "A world of joyful exuberance is unlocked, colour emerges, and the spectre of melancholic gloom gives way to music, colour, and life." Let's look at how this is captured. To give a broad sweep to this, we can see how this clip captures the film as a working through of loss and trauma, which leads to the emergence of a more fully fledged subject in a process that requires not only narrativization and storytelling, but the essential role of myth and fairy tale. Story being possible, in other words. And also, of course, the special value of music and song. The sprite that is Saoirse in Song of the Sea is profoundly other, questionably legitimate, a fly in the ointment of normality. She's a selkie. A fly in the ointment of normality. But the film celebrates her selkiness as barrier breaking, crossing worlds of thresholds, as you've seen, while also invoking the importance of spirit and body, sea and land, music, light, storytelling, myth-making, in the unforgetting of the past, in making the present. We as spectators celebrate and mourn at once. Here we see what is conveyed is the idea that ultimately it is children, the youngest generation, who carry the burden of the untold and the unremembered. Intergenerational trauma is the unworked through inheritance of preceding generations. What fails to be worked through in one generation is passed to the next. In other words, the Ireland of today carries a traumatic past that is yet to be voiced. Ireland, of course, is not alone in this, and it's interesting how in recent years this has come to be represented cinematically in the guise of children who feature as bearers of this inheritance. Another film that features a child is The Quiet Girl, a 2022 film based on Claire Keegan's exceptional 2010 novella, Foster. Set in 1981, the film is about a girl named Coit, who goes to live with older relatives for a summer away from her overburdened pregnant mother, her disinterested father, and her sisters. It was not uncommon for children to be farmed out to relatives during difficult times in families. This is a very interesting story that is told and filmed almost entirely from this perspective of Coit, a quiet girl. On one level, the film is the story of how an underdeveloped girl is loved and finds her voice, albeit a quiet one. But there is more in this beguiling story. It is also about the quiet maturing of a girl who insists on grappling with truth, the slow unveiling of a loss that has become a petrified, ungrieved secret, and forcing it out into the open so that the adults around her can begin to heal. The film splays open the difference between quietude and the unsaid, and stresses the importance of a few words well said against the empty speech of blather that I'm going to suggest to you populates the Banshees of Inisherin. A film that came out in the same year, 2022. This film, The Banshees, which is set during the Irish Civil War in the early 1920s, contrasts significantly to The Quiet Girl. The ridiculously beautiful Colin Farrell and Kerry Condren strolling around pastiches of Achill, the Arid Islands. There's that. And what I'd particularly like to highlight is the film's endless blather and the emptiness of the talk. We spend the entire film awaiting something important to happen and significant to be said between Pádraig and Colm, played by Brendan Gleeson. Pádraig is incapable of saying much that is consequential, and Colm suffers from never making good on his desire to make music. As suffering, he decides to take out on Pádraig, and on the very thing, his hand, that will make the music by cutting off his fingers. We don't feel much sympathy for Colm and his blaming of Pádraig for his failure to act instead of taking responsibility for it himself. All he can say is, "I don't want to be friends with you no more." To which Pádraig replies, "That isn't nice." What I was doing is I was tempted to flash up, but at least it's better, and I wanted to flash up an emoji. In contrast to Colm's blather and Pádraig's resentment is the figure of Codge, the quiet girl's quiet parent, a 9-year-old girl who we see is not only beginning to find her feet, but to make a place for herself with the support of Eileen and Sean, a woman who comes to love her, and the man she will eventually call Daddy, and who importantly lets her do it in spite of having lost his own biological child. Here we see that articulation is not only speech, but movement, and the free bodily movement of a girl whom we suspect will be marked henceforth with the wondrous significance of this. Tinged perhaps with our worry that it might not be enough to sustain her or any girl, not so much beyond the end of the summer as it's portrayed in the film, but as she advances into the trials of adolescence and womanhood. Might this explain why we weep, what it is that we weep for at the end of the film? The Quiet Girl is set in 1981, a time profoundly associated with austerity and trauma in Ireland. You may recall, some of you here may recall, that is the year of the Stardust tragedy in Dublin and the death of Bobby Sands, the first Irish Republican hunger-striking prisoner to die in the late years. Yeah. And the film, however, is set pastorally and domestically, and is a coming-of-age film, not only about a child, but about girlhood in a time of limited options. The Family Planning Act was passed in 1979, allowing contraception by prescription to married couples in Ireland. But it was not until 1985, in defiance of the Catholic Church, that the law was amended, allowing contraception to non-married couples. Coit's mother in The Quiet Girl and Veronica's mother in The Gathering reproduced prodigiously, and at a cost that both Coit and Veronica are unwilling to accept, or easily accept. The body, Anne Enright said in an interview, and she's especially concerned with women's bodies, quote, "is where we are. The body is the problem." And she continues, "it's the problem of the body as it's experienced rather than seen." And she goes on to rhetorically ask, "are women anatomically better designed for washing dishes?" The ownership of the body, and especially women's bodies, is one dark side of Irish history since the founding of the Irish Free State. With the church, and with the state, the church, and the social body taking a prodigious and voyeuristic interest in women's bodies as either virginal or reproductive, and those who fail to legitimately stay in line were severely punished. We're still picking up pieces of that. It's estimated that up to 60,000 unmarried mothers were consigned to mother and baby homes and laundries, and about the same number of children were born there. Some were farmed out, some placed in schools, many died, and some were adopted. Women have historically been deemed responsible for the health of the nation. Jacqueline Rose, the noted psychoanalytic and cultural theorist, notes the historical significance of psychoanalysis arriving at a moment when women hysterics were giving trouble to the ideological purchase of the social order. The hysteric was either the overeducated woman or the woman whose sexuality was uncontrolled and non-creative. Freud's intervention in the field of hysteria enabled women to articulate their desire, which exceeded then, as it does now, social and ideological categories of bodily, reproductive, and identitarian description. In psychoanalytic terms, there's no inscription of sexual difference in the unconscious that solidifies sexual or gender identity, which is why identity, in its unceasing failure, leans on the support of ideology, social practice, myth, convention, and legal frameworks. Women, in effect, embody or reproduce a problematic of identity that always exceeds identity categorizations, including those defined by reproductive capability. Enright, in her recent novel, The Wren, captures this problematic of the confinements of socially sanctioned identity in one extraordinary sentence, in which one of the main characters, Carmel, prior to her own advent into maternity, is at a baby shower, and there is a scene around the cot of a newborn. This is Carmel's cot, I'm quoting from it. The same mixture of cooing and shrieking around the cot that happened around the wedding set Carmel's teeth on edge. It was the sound women make, she thought, when they're offering their lives up for slow destruction. And loving it, and doing it for love, and feeling sorry for people who do not have this love in their lives, because my goodness, it was the winning ticket. It was success itself. It was the only game in town. History, as outlined above, has been cruel to women who have not conformed to socially designated identity standards and have failed to embody the holy Irish, that's holy with an H and WH with an I. But legitimacy is not equal to freedom, nor is illegitimacy altogether unfreeing, as Claire Keegan writes in her depiction, I suggest, of the coal man Bill Furlong, that she takes up, Bill Furlong, who takes up the cudgel of his own exile and that of the escapee from the mother and baby home in her 2021 novella, Small Things Like These, which was set in the 1950s. She leaves us pondering where it will all go. For women, their reproductive choices or lack of options constitute a repressed and symptomatic history. And the work of unrepressing this is complicated, painful, and subjectively determined. The failures of the report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes in 2021 is a testament to this. The work of Irish studies, literature, film, history, cultural studies, political studies, and critical feminist intersectional studies and psychoanalysis play an important role in the recollection of history and giving it a temporality, a placeholder within which it can be deconfected of its traumatic effects. The work of giving voice is echoed today in explorations of vernacular history, folklore traditions, oral narratives, as well as the variety of records, full and partial, along with the offerings of literature and film. Now, as in Freud's time, the psychoanalytic clinical setting is primed to support the articulation of the unconscious and the symbolization of the traumatic, the forgotten, the repressed, and the losses that change always incur. Is a place where women can take up the problematic of how identity fails to capture what a woman is. The same is true for men, but female sexuality has been especially invested with carrying or reproducing the health of the social order. The categories of women and men, which are not reducible to internal or external mechanisms of identity, are failures destined to endlessly repeat in individual histories. To finish, trauma is a point of alterity to an established narrative, a vanishing point in a viewing, a gap in a telling. Change is life, it's inevitable. The work of voicing and symbolizing this is part of a bigger endeavor to limit the oppressive effects of unacknowledged loss, traumatic repetitions, to assimilate change, to refrain from necessarily blaming the other, to continue to speak from the margins, to permit the madness of yesterday the madnesses of yesterday, and the newer ones of today a voice, so that we may continue to engage with the age-old question of what it means to be a human being. Shinawil, Mila Weeks.
One thing you didn't specifically reference, although it was implied, was the impact, namely the penal laws, very fan of. And during that horrific period, I think one of the things that was most traumatic, that maybe has not been addressed, is that the Irish language was ripped away from the people. It was illegal to speak Irish. And could you, from a Lacanian perspective, discuss the impact of that, the loss of language? Now, of course, it's a resurgence, but nonetheless, that trauma. Could you address that?
Thank you. It's a really good question. Tirgan Changa, Tirgan, relation without language is the relation by story. From Padraig Pearse, quoted yesterday by now President Catherine Conway, she was inaugurated, and she is now designated the first house in Ireland who will have Irish as its first language. Yes, that she's out there. Yes, she's indeed from the great Irish-speaking part of the country, which is going. It's very interesting. I mean, this question comes up a lot. I'm working in a profession where speaking and speaking well is consequential. It matters. This business of conducting analyses in English or in a language that is not, it is one's first language or that isn't one's first language, is a question that we constantly wrestle with. I mean, but this is a question that we wrestle with from the get-go. We read Freud, initially wrote in German, we read Lacan, wrote in French, we read these in translation as part of our training and our studies. There's something profoundly other about speech and language in any case, but to bring this back to the specifics of the Irish language and Ireland, there are some who undergo analyses in the Irish language. It's rare, but it does happen. There are some who say that unless we can engage with the question of our subjectivity and our desire through our mother tongue, we'll not necessarily get very far with it. And that's a much bigger cultural and historical question. In any case, there's a lot of good work going on about that. At the same time, there are others, and I can testify to this myself, that there's a certain distancing that comes from being able to speak about oneself, not necessarily one's mother tongue. And I'm speaking here of the many people who've conducted analyses, for example, of English. English is not their first language. We think of many variations of this. Are their analyses any worse off because of that? I'm not convinced that that is true. I think we have to give very important, we have to emphasize very carefully in the work with people who are not doing their analysis in their mother tongue, the role of moments in which the mother tongue rises to the surface, and that is voiced and articulated. It's a complicated question. It's been a long time since we've given up speaking Irish widely. For now, in many ways, English is our first language. But there is a big question for us to continue exploring what it is that we have lost. That's a huge ongoing piece of work and a very, very necessary piece of work. You saw how the Song of the Sea brings in the parts of art, and then the adaptation of Claire Keegan's Foster as the quiet girl of Connie Hume in the Irish language. So it's a very significant question, and there's a mountain of work to be done. Yeah. And indeed, President Connolly yesterday referred to the family also in an inauguration speech. Significance.
Hello. You talked a little bit towards the beginning about the differences between like oral stories and written stories, and then across your examples, a thing that I was sort of wondering between like Foster and our colleague Kuhn, are there different advantages or disadvantages or just differences in general between depictions of these sorts of narratives and views across film versus literature?
What was the first part of it?
Oh, when you talked about the difference between like written and oral stories.
Well, I mean, I have to say I'm particularly wedded to word, to signifier, and that is, I suppose, my first love. But I've become very interested over the last number of years in film, and we have arrived, many would say, in an age in which the image has come to dominate over the word. So we're perhaps foolish to ignore the consequence of the image and moving image in this case. One thing that interests me about film is, well, film and literature generally, is how it often anticipates cultural stresses and problematics. I mean, it does a very good job of that. But I'm very interested in film as a pedagogical tool, which may come as a surprise because in a profession where the case study, the written case study, and the oral presentation of the case study is of critical importance. There's nothing more important than that. I nonetheless find that the use of film is incredibly effective when it comes to teaching elements of psychoanalytic practice, in fact. It can be deeply effective. And that has something to do, of course, with the importance of the oral and the visual and those drives that are activated very early for us in childhood. We're interested in the notion of the partial drives. And so I find that film is actually it can be a very effective medium for teaching pedagogically. I mean, I've become drawn and watered by the psychoanalytic profession for suggesting that film can be sometimes as successful as a case study. But there you go, I said.
If there be more, we'll do this one more cut.
I was just wondering about the three clips that you showed, like the relation between, or like what the relation to each other, and then the relation to what you were talking about. I was just noticing that it's very interesting in the third clip that the shot of the trees, like it looks like it's like her perspective, but it can't be because she's running, right? And it seemed as if the actual locus of perspective is something like his imagining of her experience or something. And then I was also thinking in the first clip that, I mean, it also had a similar kind of structure of where what the important thing that seems to be going on is actually the reaction to the person talking, as much as the, like, he's saying something and then the question of like whether it lands with the other person or something. I just wondering if this is like, and likewise, I was just also in the middle clip, I was just thinking of this structural thing in like teenage or children's films where the breakthrough or whatever important epiphany happens, you need to convene an audience for it. And I was just wondering, like, I mean, is it like in, it's like lots of these teen films that are like, the important thing happens when then suddenly there's like a gym, like assembly in a gym or something, and everyone has to like watch you have this. Whereas like, it seems like our breakthroughs in life actually happen like alone. You don't have like an audience for them. And except that I thought, well, except like in psychoanalysis, I was thinking of the analyst sitting there as the witness or something to the like. So I was wondering if that's the like connection, like in all these. In other words, it seems to be like there's something about the third, there's something about the like the perspective of being seen, or is that part of what's going on? I don't know. Is there a question that we can answer?
Well, that hit on something very important in psychoanalysis, which is the notion of being art, which is always art. There's never, ever a duality when it comes to the subject and the other, small. There's always a big other, which is, and this is categories of being language, symbolic, history, conventional, authority. There's many different resonances. But it works as sometimes an unseen authority or authenticator or witness that can occur. And I think we just very nicely pointed out instances of that. But, even when it comes to the infant and crib speech, you can say they're addressing already the big other is there, somehow listening and watching. So this is, sometimes this becomes very serious and very consequential for people who might, for example, have a paranoid disposition. This is very intimidating because it's always watching or speaking. So big other is always there, and I think in various ways is represented in these clips. With the quiet girl and the image of the trees, I fancy it was my own sort of fancy that she was looking up at the trees. But you're absolutely right. No person knows what is probably looking at the trees. But it really, you actually highlighted something with the head when you thought about, which is that the significance and the sound of the trees and the wind. It begins with her in the long grass in the urban field, and the sound of the wind. I think the sound of the wind is an accompaniment to the trees. And there are lots of soundings and pastoral soundings throughout this film. And we didn't see it in the text from but the cuckoo is an important sound that appears not in a moment, but again signifying the disappearance of the cuckoo is disappearing. But these moments that they offer these are temporal moments that capture something reflective, something of significance. That I mean, I'm interested in spectatorship. How are we affected in those moments? So thank you.
And so thank you.